All righty. Well, thank you very much for your attention. We'll get into the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah arrived in Judah, and he was appointed at some point. He was appointed to be the governor of Judea by the Persian king. And the Persian king actually changes a couple times in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But just so you're aware of that, in Nehemiah's time, the problem was the wall of Jerusalem and the houses inside Jerusalem were just completely trashed. They were torn down. The temple had been built. By the time that Nehemiah starts, the temple had been built and existed in Jerusalem. But the walls of the city did not exist, and the houses inside the city were all broken down. So in Nehemiah chapter 6:15, and what I want to do is I just want to do what would be a quick overview. Starting in Nehemiah 6:15, says, so the wall was finished in the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. Now, Elul is the 6th month. Many of you, as I see your faces, are familiar with Nisan, the 1st month, and Tishri, the 7th month. Elul is the month before Tishri on the Hebrew calendar. It usually falls in September, October, just like Tishri usually falls in, August, September. Elul usually falls in August or September, just as Tishri normally falls in September or October. And remember, the reason that we can't be sure about when these months were was that the Hebrews used a lunar calendar. And a lunar calendar is 11 days shorter than our Gregorian calendar. So if I started along with, say, King David, and we both started on the first day of the year, my January 1, his Nisan 1, at the end of my year, December 31st, and at the end of his year, Adar 30th, they do Adar 30th on or about December 20th. And that would be 1 year. Well, then the next year it's going to be December 9th. And then the next year it's not even going to be December. It's going to be November somewhere. And so their calendar kept changing, and that's why we can't get an absolute date and say the month Elul was August or the month of Elul was September, because sometimes it was August and sometimes it was September. So I hope that explanation was clear. So here they are in 6:15, and they finished the wall. So now we let's go to chapter 7. So in Nehemiah chapter 7, let's see if I've got this. Yeah, okay. Nehemiah chapter 7. And here we're going to make a hop from the 6th month to the 7th month. So when we get down to the very last verse of Nehemiah 7, verse 73, talks about the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, some of the people, the temple servants, all Israel lived in their cities. This becomes important because the people scattered. Remember, Jerusalem was basically uninhabitable, so the people scattered. Now, what's going to happen is they're going to start to rebuild Jerusalem, but they have a hard time talking people into living there because most people don't like to live in a city that looks like it's been bombed to death, which Jerusalem did. So verse 73 finishes up, when the 7th month had come, the children of Israel were in their cities. So then we go to chapter 8. And in chapter 8, all the people gathered themselves together before the water gate, and they spoke to Ezra, and they get a reading of the law. And in the law, they learn about the festival of booths. So verse 13 of Nehemiah 8, on the 2nd day, the heads of the fathers' households of all the people and the priests and the Levites gathered together to Ezra the scribe to gain insight into the words of the law, and they found written in the law that Yahweh had commanded by Moses that the children of Israel were to dwell in booths during the feast of the 7th month. Feast of the 7th month, you and I know as the Feast of Tabernacles. And Feast of Tabernacles starts on the 15th day of the month of Tishri. and it ends after 8 days. It's technically a seventh day, fifth, but then they have what they call an octave, and they have an 8th day to the feast. So basically, we went from the 6th month in Nehemiah 6 to the 7th month in Nehemiah 7 and 8, and then there's readings of the law, and there's countings of populations and stuff like that, and we hop all the way over to Nehemiah chapter 11. And in Nehemiah chapter 11, verse 1, the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, and 9/10 in the other cities. Now, if you remember from before, because Jerusalem was a wreck, everybody lived in their own cities. Not too many people lived in Jerusalem, and they're trying to rebuild the population of Jerusalem. So basically, they simply cast lots. And, that would be, I mean, at least in that culture, they really believed, and with some, for good reason, really, that God had his hand on the lot. It'd be like you and I throwing dice, high man wins. Somebody gets the high man, and we just believe that that's God's choice. Because if you've been living comfortably out in your city and people cast lots, and all of a sudden it's like, well, God chose you to live in Jerusalem. And you're like, oh, okay. And that's the way they're going to repopulate Jerusalem, by taking 1 person in 10 from the wider population of Judea, and they're going to put them in Jerusalem. And so that's how Jerusalem got populated. So now we go forward to chapter 12, verse 27, because as they began to build the population of Jerusalem, now all of a sudden we can take care of things that we didn't need to take care of before, or weren't in a position to take care of before. So now we're going to start reading at chapter 12, verse 27. And remember that Nehemiah is the governor, and he's coordinating this. And I love what he does here, verse 27, at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah understood how important that wall of Jerusalem was to the people of Judea. Jerusalem is the place that God said, I will put my house there. They now had a temple there. God was resident there in their minds, which of course he was in a very practical sense. And so now they've got this wall built, and Nehemiah, and rightly so, says we need to dedicate the wall. And he does it with a lot of fanfare. And it was interesting, the emotions I went through as I read this and prepared for this teaching, because I don't really like dedications. I don't like ceremonies and that kind of thing. Even when the Olympics were coming up, I specifically made sure I didn't watch the opening ceremony. I hate that kind of stuff. I didn't watch the closing ceremony. That I just, the pomp and pageantry, I mean, some people love it, but it just kind of leaves me cold. And so I have to deal with that, and say, pomp and ceremony does a lot for a lot of people. And Nehemiah really understood that. And I think as a leader and as a human being, that's something that that we need to get in touch with. I need to get in touch within myself, that if you need to have a celebration, then have a celebration. It helps anchor the people. So here, 27, the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out the Levites out of all the places to bring them to Jerusalem. And we'll learn more about in Nehemiah chapter 13, why the Levites are in all the places instead of being around the temple. But they sought out the Levites to bring them to Jerusalem to keep the dedication with gladness, both with giving thanks and with singing, with cymbals, with lyres, with harps. Verse 28, and the sons of the singers gathered together both out of the plain around Jerusalem and from the villages. And it goes on about the Levites. And then verse 31, I brought up the officials of Judah on the wall. And watch what he does here. He brings up the officials of Judah on the wall and appointed 2 great choirs who gave thanks and went in procession. And what Nehemiah is going to do now, which is very interesting, researchers have pretty much concluded that Nehemiah gathered this whole group together in what is known today as the Jaffa Gate. It's the west gate of Jerusalem. It's on the far west side of the city. And we have remnants there going way, way back. So we're pretty confident there was a gate there that is incredibly ancient. So that's the west gate. Well, what Nehemiah is going to do here is because he's going to take this great crowd of Levites, priests, officials, singers, people with musical instruments. He's going to break them into two parts. And half of them are going to walk on the wall around the north side of the city and they're on the west side of the city starting out, end up on the far east side of the city. And guess what's on the far east side of the city? If you think the temple, you're right. The temple's on the far east side of the city. So one half of this group marches around the north side. That's the group that's mentioned here in verse 31. And then the other the other group is mentioned in verse 38. And look how the text says this. Verse 31, I brought up the officials of Judah on the wall and appointed two great choirs. And some of the older versions didn't pick up on the Hebrew of this, but literally people are singing and they're laughing and they're playing musical instruments. So it's really these groups are actually called choirs. So he makes two great choirs who gave thanks and went in procession. And one choir went on the right hand on the wall toward the dung gate. Now, in order to be able to interpret that, we have to remember that in the biblical world, the world faced east. The tabernacle opened to the east, the temple opened to the east. And so when you looked east, then on your right hand was south and your left hand was north. So here it says one went on the right hand on the wall toward the dung gate. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you know the dung gate is on the south side because it leads down to the Hinnom Valley where the garbage was taken and all the yuck was burned. And that's where we get the word Gehenna. So what it's telling you is this group went on the right hand, looking east, they went on the right hand, so they went south. So this first group goes south toward the dung gate, and then it gives you a bunch of people that got to go in that group and the gates that they passed and the ascent of the wall and that kind of thing. Drop down to verse 38. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north or the right hand. I'm sorry, to the left hand. Went to the north to the left hand. And I after them with half of the people. So basically Nehemiah is in the half that goes north, and they go on the wall past the Tower of the Ovens as far as the broad wall and then the gate. And so it goes through the gates and this and that. So you've got two groups now, one walking to the east side of Jerusalem on top of the wall, south way, one to the temple east wall by the north way. And verse 40, so the two companies of those who gave thanks stood in God's house. They marched all the way around this wall that was completed. So they got every section of the wall they had worked so hard on was completed, and they marched around that to celebrate the completion of that wall. And they met, verse 40, the two companies of those who gave thanks stood in God's house. Of course, we know that is the temple. And I and half of the rulers with me. And then he goes on to talk about what they're going to do. There's the priests with trumpets, and then all these other guys. And then in verse 42, the singers sang loud, and they've got a song leader. And then verse 43, and I love this. They offered great sacrifice that day and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. Let's unpack that a second. they completed the wall. Now, if you from the outside looking in, you could say, God didn't have a lot to do with that because the people were the ones that worked so hard. They were the ones that lifted the stones. They were the ones that cleared the rubble. They were the ones that were willing to work, wearing their weapons. They didn't even undress at nighttime because of the threat of the enemy. And yet we know that they were praying all the time, and God answered those prayers. And the enemy, who was, stronger, better armed, more organized than they were, the enemy didn't get in and were afraid and dealt with their own problems. So God had really stepped in and done a great thing here. And that's why it says, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. It's not that God forced them to rejoice. It's that God had so worked in the situation that they couldn't help but rejoice. And that's, kind of where we want to be in our life, that God works in our life so much that we rejoice with great joy. And then it goes on to say, and the women also, when the children rejoiced. And that's a wonderful thing. So many times in these assemblies and stuff, the women were left out. They were back home watching the children or whatever. And in this case, not only were the men there, along with priests, Levites, rulers, leaders, elders, all the uppity up of Judea, but the men were there, their wives were there, and their children were there, and they all rejoiced. And you can tell they were loud about it because the verse closes and says, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard far away. And that's exactly what we want to happen. The joy of Jerusalem gets heard far away. And then that march must have started fairly early in the day, because a lot happened. Now, granted, Jerusalem's not that large, and it doesn't take you that long to walk around the walls. I've done the wall walk in Jerusalem, and it doesn't take hours and hours. If you keep up a pretty decent pace, you can get it done. It's about all the way around. It's between 3.5 and 4 miles. The modern wall, the ancient wall, may not have been quite that big. But anyway, so these guys are singing in verse 44. On that day, men were appointed for the storerooms for the wave offerings, the first fruits and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by law for the priests and Levites, according to the fields of the cities, because obviously, you're taking a tithe of the grain, so you're taking a tenth. So the bigger the fields, the more grain you had. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and for the Levites who ministered. And that's a really cool thing here now in Nehemiah, because so many times, if you read the prophet Jeremiah, if you read the prophet Isaiah, you read the prophet Ezekiel, you read the book of Malachi, the priests and the Levites really fell down on the job. They were corrupt. They took bribes. We'll actually deal with a little of that in chapter 13. But here the people are thanking God and blessing God for the priests and that kind of thing. In verse 45, they performed the duty of their God and the duty of the purification, and so did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the commandment of David and of Solomon his son. Verse 46, for long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there was a director of the singers and songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And you can see that if you go back into the book of 2 Samuel and 1 Kings. Verse 47, in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah, all Israel gave the daily portions to the singers and the gatekeepers, and then they set apart what was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart what was for the sons of Aaron. And that's kind of interesting too, because it requires honest record keeping, if you will, honest accounting of what you have, because the people gave to the Levites. It's the Levites' job to give a tithe to the priests. And so that's what they're doing here. And basically what it is they're taking care of the ministers. Now, the law was set up so that the ministers would be taken care of. But there were so many times in biblical history when people didn't take care of the leaders. And I've got to tell you, there was a whole lot of times where I wouldn't have taken care of them either. They were corrupt and miserable, you know. But that was what was happening here. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 1. On that day, they read from the book of Moses. So, if we go back to chapter 12, it was that day that they walked the wall. It was that day that they appointed people to oversee the storerooms. So there's a lot going on that day. And now we go to chapter 13, and there's more going on that day. On that day, they read, this would be the priests typically, sometimes the Levites, read from the book of Moses in the hearing of all the people. And it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite was to ever enter into the assembly of God, because they didn't meet with the children of Israel with food and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. And you can read that record in Numbers chapter 22. That's when Israel was coming out of Egypt. They were in what was called the plains of Moab, which is the flat area on the east side of the Jordan River, just before you cross the Jordan River to get into Israel. And they were there, and the Moabites were frightened by them, and they teamed up with the Ammonites, or no, they teamed up with I don't remember who it was, but one of the tribes down there, along with the Moabites. And you can read it in Numbers 22. But they teamed up together and then hired Balaam to curse them, and then Balaam ended up blessing Israel. But because of that, they read that it was in the law of Moses that an Ammonite or Moabite was not to enter the assembly of God, meaning that they would not be accepted if they said, hey, we want to be part of Israel. The law states until the 10th generation. People sometimes waffled on that. Ruth didn't, for example, didn't have to wait until the 10th generation, that kind of thing. But in any case, verse 3, and when they had heard the law, they separated from Israel all those who were of mixed ancestry. Now, this is kind of a cleanup, because if you read Ezra, and Ezra chapter, I believe it's Ezra chapter 9 and 10, I believe, Ezra spent 2 chapters dealing with the mixed marriages. And in the book of Ezra, people were very the people were very direct about the law of Moses. The people who had married any of the Canaanites divorced their wives and then moved forward with their life to find an Israeli woman. And when I read that many years ago, I was scandalized, but it's what Israel needed to do to protect themselves. And I think Ezra made the right move. And the other thing you learn is in that biblical culture, the families were so close that and frankly, husbands died, regularly. Like, there's so many things that could kill a person. The average lifespan of a man at the time of Christ was 38. Average lifespan of a woman at the time of Christ was 32. People died very suddenly, very quickly. Appendicitis, an infection, a million other things that could happen, an accident while working, that kind of thing. So families were large and tight, and so the women would be accepted back into their birth family. But in any case, they separated from all Israel those who were of mixed ancestry. Now, here in Nehemiah, what we find out as we read farther is that Nehemiah did not require the men to divorce their wives, just simply don't do it again. And so there's a separation in time between what Ezra did and what Nehemiah did. By the way, I've learned something this year that I really had never put together. Bill Schlegel and I were translating through Genesis. Oh gosh, I'm wrestling because I don't know if I can find this. It may be Uh, Genesis 45:7 is one of them. Genesis maybe 49. No, it's not Genesis 49. There's a place where the people who go into Egypt are counted in Genesis. It's worth taking a look at. Yes, let's go to Genesis 46. I wasn't planning to show you this, but I think this is important. It answered a huge question for me because I'd simply read this. I'd never really paid much attention to it. I'd never, until Bill and I literally translated every single word, I'd never really put all the facts together. But in Genesis 46:8, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came into Egypt, Jacob and his sons, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn." And then it goes through this whole list of people. And then when you get down to verse 27, it says, "The sons of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70." And I just believed that and thought, okay, so 70 people went into Egypt. Well, that's not true. When you read the list, there are no wives mentioned at all. So, for example, there were the 12 sons of Jacob. Each one of them was married. Some of them, like I believe Benjamin, had based on the number of children he had in his short lifetime, I believe Benjamin had multiple wives. So you would have to add more people to the 70 to add up to the wives, plus some of the children. They may have already had wives, and none of them are mentioned either. Then there was the time, if you remember, when Simeon and Levi killed the men of Shem, we call it Shechem, and when they killed the men of Shechem, it says Jacob and his company, they gathered up all the women and children from the whole city and took them with them. And so Jacob had this whole troop of people, and they went into Egypt. And there were considerably more than 70. And so then if we take that and go, okay, what's God doing here? Well, he's counting the sons of Jacob to kind of get the genealogy right. Brought back to Genesis 45. And in Genesis chapter 45, verse 7, there's a very interesting verse. And I know I'm getting away from Nehemiah a little bit, but it'll make sense in a second. In Genesis 45:7, what's going on is the brothers, Jacob's brothers, are thinking that now that Joseph's brothers, his 11 brothers, are thinking, oh my gosh, when Jacob, our father, dies, then Joseph is going to kill us all because he's really mad at us, but he doesn't want to hurt his father's feelings. So he's not going to kill us while Jacob's alive. But when Jacob dies, we're all dead men. And so they're worried about this. And so Joseph steps in, and here's what he says. He says, "God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save you alive by a great deliverance." And when it said that God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, we know that the nation of Israel survived and thrived inside Egypt. And it went from being, a couple hundred disparate people in that list we just read in Genesis 46 to being basically a full nation that walked out of Egypt. Now, how could that happen? And one of the ways it happened was the Egyptians were incredibly xenophobic. When we read that list or looked at that list in Genesis chapter 46, and it says, "These are the sons of Israel who came into Egypt, Jacob and his sons," and then you go through the sons of the sons of Jacob, and you look at that list and you go, wait a minute. None of those guys married a daughter of Jacob. A daughter of Jacob's mentioned, her name's Dinah. But not one of those married a daughter of Jacob. or of Isaac above him, or of Abraham. There's not one of those sons who it says married so and so, the descendant of Abraham, or so and so, the descendant of Isaac, or so and so, their sister, a daughter of Jacob. So all of these people, including Jacob himself, by the way, married a Canaanite. So if you have Jacob and he's got all these sons and he's got these descendants, and every one of them marries a Canaanite, what's going to happen to the children of Israel in fairly short order, just a couple generations? They're all going to be Canaanites. They're going to be absorbed into the Canaanite culture. Now, so interestingly enough, in God's economy, and this is what I'm just working and learning at this point, because of their sin and doing what they did to Joseph, they ended up in Egypt. Well, it was hard on them there, but they developed into a nation. And the Egyptians were xenophobic. The Egyptians were way too arrogant to marry someone that wasn't an Egyptian. So God, in moving this whole family unit down into Egypt, completely protected it because they never intermarried. Not because they wouldn't have, but because the Egyptian wouldn't have them. So they didn't intermarry, and they formed this nation. Now we go back to Nehemiah. And in Nehemiah, now you've got the situation where here the Israelites are, and what are they doing? They come back from the Babylonian captivity into Judah, and they begin to intermarry with all the pagans. And remember that the king of Assyria had brought pagans down, then there were pagans who moved in and took over part of the territory, and this and that, and the other thing. And so now the Israelites are marrying the pagans. This is what would have happened in Jacob's generation, except, whoops, they ended up in Egypt. But the pagans are more than happy to marry him. So now Ezra and then Nehemiah have to step in and say, you guys don't get what's going on here. Spiritually, what's going on is God's trying to produce a cocoon of people into which the Messiah can be born. You want the Messiah to be born into a society that elevates God, that keeps the law of Moses, and that's going to be a society of Israelites who have all entered the covenant with that God made with at Sinai, Exodus chapter 24, and that kind of thing. And they all keep the law, they all keep the Sabbath, they all do the sacrifices. And sure enough, Mary and Joseph did exactly that. The Bible is very clear in saying Joseph was a righteous man, meaning that he kept the law. Mary, of course, was a wonderful, godly woman. And so what we have with what God did in Israel was he created a cocoon into which Jesus Christ could be born, learn the law, keep the law, and become the perfect sacrifice. But in order to do that, you had to have a cocoon, which meant cleaning out the people that were trying to tear it apart, which of course would be the devil and the pagans. So that is why when we're talking here about Ezra and Nehemiah, why they were so dedicated to removing the mixed marriages or stopping the mixed marriages, because they wanted a pure Israelite group who were committed to the law of Moses, even though the Pharisees and scribes and stuff twisted it. Still, the basic law of Moses was there. And so that's a lot of what's going on here with this mixed multitude. Interestingly enough, if a person wanted to become a Jew and moved into Israel, and particularly for the men, got circumcised and made a commitment to keep the law, then they could move into Israel and participate in the sacrifices and the feasts and that kind of thing. So anyway, so that's why in Nehemiah, in Ezra, two whole chapters in Ezra, and in Nehemiah here, these verses, and we'll read more, we're all about purity of the Israelite people. So then verse 4, now it says, now before this, Elishama, the priest, Eliashib, the priest, who'd been appointed over the storerooms of the house of God, and who was related to Tobiah. Now, if you remember from Nehemiah 1, 2, 3, 4, Tobiah was an enemy of Nehemiah. He'd never been a friend of Nehemiah. He was an enemy of Nehemiah from the very start. And here's Eliashib the priest. Who is Eliashib likely? Keep a ribbon here or whatever. Let's go to Nehemiah chapter 3. And it says, then Eliashib, the high priest, rose up with his brothers, the priests, and they built the sheep gate. So it is likely that Eliashib is the high priest. And that's, he might not have been, there may have been another priest. We're not really sure, but it's likely that Eliashib was the high priest. And you'll see why I think that in just a second. Now, before this, Eliashib the priest, who'd been appointed over the storerooms of the house of God and who was related to Tobiah, had prepared for him, for Tobiah, a large room where previously they had put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the temple articles, the tithes of the grain, the new wine, and the oil, which were commanded to be given to the Levites and the singers and the gatekeepers. And by the way, also they kept the contribution for the priests there. So this is a large room. When it says it's a large room, no kidding. You look at all the stuff. I mean, just the grain offerings themselves took up a lot of room. And then to have all these other things, this was a large room. And what did Eliashib do? He's the high priest. I believe he was the high priest because he is just a regular priest. He wouldn't have had the authority to just take the room that was set aside for the tithes and offerings and clean it out and give it to the governor's enemy inside the temple. I mean, and what I look here and what I see is how a person in chapter 3, I believe he's helping to build the wall. So you think, well, this is a good guy. I mean, he's the high priest and he's down there with the people and he's working. But here in chapter 13, he's making a room inside the temple for Nehemiah's enemy. And there's one of the things that I see here is that people are a mix of good and bad. And that's one of the things that we see here. And, when we're in relationship with people, well, first of all, in ourselves, we want to go before the Lord and get as much of the bad out as we can so that we're a whole lot more good. But when we're dealing with people, it's just something that we've got to be aware of. There are people that are like generally good people, but they make bad choices or bad decisions or do bad things. And that's just the way that people are. And that's what's going on here. So he prepares this room and gives it to Tobiah. Now, how could that possibly be? Verse 6 explains it. But during this time, I was not at Jerusalem. And you remember in chapter 1, Nehemiah asked permission to come to Judea. The king Artaxerxes gave him permission. And he also said, okay, this is the time I'll be gone. So now Nehemiah's got to go back and be in Persia. And so, but he's going to come back. But during this time, I was not at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon. Now, Artaxerxes is the king of Persia, but Persia had conquered Babylon. So Babylon became a province of the Persian Empire. And then, of course, where Nehemiah went, one of the places he went was Babylon. So Artaxerxes, the king of that too. He says, I went to Artaxerxes, I went to the king. Then after some time, after some time, I asked the king for a leave of absence. And so now he's leaving the king again. Verse 7, and I came to Jerusalem and discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by providing him a room in the courtyard of God's house. In verse 8 is interesting. I was greatly displeased. And we see this with Jesus Christ. Jesus, when he saw the tables of the money changers and he saw the people being taken advantage of, and make no mistake, the way the Sadducees ran the temple, they were incredibly dishonest. First of all, and you guys may know all this, first of all, at the time of Christ, they said, well, regular money, like if I don't have any money in my pocket, but let's say I did. So, if I reached in my pocket and pulled out money and so I'm going to buy a sacrifice, we said, no, 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 you can't do that. That's like worldly money. You have to buy sacrifices with holy money. And so what they did was they minted their own money, and then they said, you need this money to buy the sacrifices for the temple. Well, how do you get that money? Well, you have to pay your dirty money for it, except they jacked up the price. It's like, I'll give you this holy dollar so you can buy a sacrifice for $2. If you wanted to buy a sacrifice, you had to pay the $2 to get the $1 to pay for the sacrifice. And so the Sadducees had this huge scheme going that they were just ripping the people off left and right. And that's why Jesus Christ, one of the two reasons why Jesus Christ kicked over the money changers' money, because the whole game was dishonest. Also, they weren't supposed to be making a profit on those animals. They should be helping the people out. So Jesus Christ just cleared the place. But in any case, Nehemiah was gone from Jerusalem, and he comes back, discovers the evil that Tobiah had done, and he was greatly displeased, just like Jesus was greatly upset. And that then speaks to you and I too. I understand that Ephesians says, be angry, but sin not. And that's exactly right. Christians, it's not that we can't get angry. We need to learn to control our anger so that it's at the right time, right place, right amount, and we can dissipate it. We don't walk around with a grudge and that kind of thing. But Nehemiah here is greatly displeased. And I wonder if when Jesus Christ read this, it really doesn't talk about Jesus Christ reflecting on this and thinking, well, yeah, I know that at some point in my ministry, I'm probably going to be displeased about something, and just kind of take some of the pressure off. So I love this verse 8. He threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the room. And that tells you that Tobiah was living there. That what Eliashib, gosh, I've got to get that right. Eliashib, the high priest, had allowed Tobiah to have an apartment there. Basically, remember, Tobiah was up in Samaria. That's where he lived. And so, but he would come down and visit Jerusalem. And for one reason, he had family there connected by marriage. And so Eliashib, the priest, simply cleared out this room in the temple and made it Tobiah's apartment, which is just completely ridiculous. But that just shows you how out of touch some people can be. So Nehemiah is greatly displeased. He throws all the household goods out of the room. Verse 9, then I gave orders that they purify the rooms because they needed to be Levitically clean again. And I brought back there the articles of the house of God with the grain offerings and frankincense. And that's part of the job of rulers. If you're in a position of a leader, the position of a ruler, and in any case, and you're over something, part of your job is, if things get messed up, to step in there and make them godly again. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. He stepped in. He wasn't even a priest, but he stepped in and he made things godly again. And he brought those things back in verse 10. And you can see him kind of thinking to himself, well, where have the Levites been during all this? What is going on here? And then verse 10 says, I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. Yeah, well, they emptied out the room where they kept all the tithes. So when it came time to feed the Levites, there wasn't anything there. So the portion of the Levites had not been given to them. Now, golly, can you imagine being Eliashib, the high priest, and your Levites aren't being taken care of. Remember, there was 3 sons of Levi. There was Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate that. So the Levites weren't fed, verse 10. The portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled, everyone to his own field. Now, the word fled's a hyperbole because obviously they weren't chased out. But why would God use a hyperbole here? Because they were forced out. If you're not being fed, then sooner or later you've got to leave. You've got to change your residence. You've got to take care of yourself. If you've lost your job, you just can't sit around and say, "Gosh, I wish I hadn't lost my job." You need an income, you get another job. And so here it uses the word fled. It's not like anybody was chasing them to kill them, but they fled because they were in great need. And so where are the Levites? The Levites and the singers who did the work had fled, everyone to his own field. All the Levites went home. Well, no wonder that Nehemiah, when he wanted to dedicate the wall, had to go out and round up the Levites. You could say, well, there was a temple there. Why weren't the Levites in Jerusalem? Well, now we know. Because until Nehemiah got there, the Levites they weren't being fed. And verse 11, so I contended with the rulers. And the word contended here is a deep word. It's the word reeve, and it can refer many times in the Bible, it refers to having a lawsuit. When Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 12 says, I'm thinking about a lawsuit with Yahweh, thinking about taking God to court. It's the same word. When God says in Hosea 4, I have a lawsuit with the people of Israel because they don't know me, because they're worshiping idols and that kind of thing. That's this word here. Now, it doesn't have to be a technical lawsuit. It can be contending in court or even contending person to person. It's going to come up a couple times. So verse 10, so I contended with the rulers and said, why is God's house abandoned? I mean, it was there. They had built it at great cost. Why is God's house abandoned? Then I gathered the Levites together and restored them to their places, which obviously, and watch what happens, because this is really cool. So Nehemiah comes in, he's a strong leader. He stops the evil of Eliashib, and he restores the Levites and restores the place for the temple offerings and that kind of thing. And then verse 12, then all Judah brought the tithes of grain and the new wine and the oil to the storerooms. Why didn't they bring it there before? What's the point? And if you get that, it's, I feel that way. I mean, frankly, I feel that way about paying my taxes. If I knew my taxes were going to make a strong military to take care of people who really needed to be taken care of, to build bridges and highways and a strong infrastructure for the United States of America to make America great, I wouldn't mind paying taxes. But when I find out that my taxes are going to all kinds of frivolous costs all over everywhere, and frankly, being I think a lot of it's just frankly just wasted, or it goes into the pockets of those people that are smart enough to figure out how to siphon it off for themselves, and all of a sudden you resent paying taxes. Well, these are the people, they know that, I mean, they're living out in the world. They know the Levites are out among them. They know the Levites aren't in the temple. What's the point? If I'm going to feed the Levites, I'm going to bring them over for dinner and I'm going to feed them. Why am I going to give my tithes to the temple if God knows where it'll go, but it's not going to feed the Levites because they're already there? And so I love this because it shows you what happens when good leadership gets in place. When good leadership's in place, they take care of evil, they restore the things that are right, and the people respond. And that's exactly what you see here with verse 12. As soon as Nehemiah straightens things out, all Judah brought the tithe of the grain and the new wine and the oil, and there it is. Well, then, verse 13, you need something you didn't need before, which is supervisors, because you didn't have anything to supervise before. So now, verse 13, as supervisors over the storehouses, I appointed Shelemiah the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and from the Levites, Pedaiah, and next to them was Hanan, and all this stuff. So and why does he do that? For they were considered faithful. Doesn't say they had connections, they knew anybody, they were married to somebody, whatever. They were considered faithful. They'd been tried and tested in the work, and they'd been successful, and they'd been faithful. And that's what we would like to see in our government, that people don't get jobs because they know somebody, or they've donated to a cause, or they've married somebody's sister or whatever it is, but you get a job in the government because you're considered faithful. And it says in their tasks, these supervisors was to distribute to their fellow Levites. And that's really great. And that takes, really care and concern, because, these guys from Judah come walking in with baskets of grain. Well, the Levites are supposed to get some of that. And, you got to divide that up evenly and make sure that everybody gets their fair share. And that's exactly what these guys did, these supervisors. And then verse 14, very interesting verse. Remember me, oh my God, concerning this. So that's number one. We've got to remember when we're praying to pray for ourselves. Don't forget to pray for yourself. You need prayer as much as the next guy. Now, if you have a huge family, you probably have people praying for you you may not even know about. But it's important that we honor ourselves enough to pray for ourselves. And Nehemiah says, remember me, oh my God, concerning this. And then Nehemiah is humble. He's in touch with his own sin. He's in touch with his shortcomings. Ecclesiastes says there's not a human on earth that has not sinned. We all know Romans chapter 3, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And if you're really trying hard to be righteous before God, you're very aware of the times that you fall short. We just are. And so that's just a human tendency. And so I love that it shows up in Nehemiah, because he wasn't so arrogant that he thought he did everything right, and he wasn't worried about the judgment, because he is concerned about the judgment. I'm concerned about my judgment, and I try to do everything right, but I'm still, I just know there's so many places that I slip or fall or fail or whatever, and so here's Nehemiah, remember me, oh my God, concerning this. And then he says, and do not wipe out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God and for its service. And so this, do not wipe out my good deeds that I've done. Nehemiah was well aware of the book that God was keeping. In Revelation chapter 20 talks about the books were opened and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of those things written in the books. You guys remember that? You know what? Let's just go there. This is such an important verse. But if we will go to Revelation chapter 20, and we go to verse 11, and I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heavens fled away, and there was no place found for them, which is a hyperbolic way of saying, if you think you're going to hide from the last judgment, you're mistaken. Anybody who hasn't been judged before this final judgment will be judged. There's no place to hide. Verse 12, and I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. And what books are those? Those are the books that the angel scribes are writing down about the things that you're thinking, saying, and doing. The books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged out of the things that were written in the books according to their works. And so when people stand before the judgment, how are you sure you're going to get a just judgment? Because these books, not these books, but the books that'll be opened at the Bema, they're different books. But, God is having these books written. Moses was well aware of this. If we go to Numbers chapter 32, I'm sorry, I said Numbers, it's Exodus chapter 32. And in verse 32, the children of Israel had just made a golden calf. And in verse 31, Moses said, the people have sinned a great sin. He knew they'd sinned a great sin. But Moses loved those people. It's one of the reasons he did what he did and continued doing what he was doing. And so Moses says in verse 32, yet now, if you would only forgive their sin, but if not, please blot me out of your book that you have written. And how did Moses know about that? It was apparently passed down just from things that God had given by revelation to various people. And I love Moses. I love Yahweh's answer to Moses. Whoever has sinned against me, him will I blot out of my book. As for you, go on. We're not gonna request and get blotted out of God's book. This is not gonna happen. So anyway, that's what's going on. Let's see. And so that's what verse 14, Nehemiah, don't wipe out my good deeds. And then basically the rest of the chapter, verse 15, he sees people treading the winepress on the Sabbath, and he warns them to stop. And then there were foreigners, men of Tyre. They brought in fish and goods, and he warned them to stop. And then in verse 17, he contended, and this is that word again, before he contended with the leaders. Now he contends with the nobles. And, what are you doing, profaning the Sabbath? This brought evil upon our fathers. Then he takes care of making sure the gates of Jerusalem are shut. Then verse 20, the merchants and sellers of goods came and camped outside Jerusalem, and he warns them. And then verse 22, he commands the Levites to purify themselves. And then in the last verses, he takes care of the mixed marriages and tells the people to quit it, to cut it out. And then I think the ending of Nehemiah is interesting. Verse 30, then I cleansed them, meaning the priests and the Levites, from all the foreigners, and appointed duties for the priests and for the Levites, everyone in his work. And I arranged for the wood offering at appointed times and for the first fruit. And then it's almost like Nehemiah does what I'm doing, thinking, gosh, I'm running out of time. So he just goes, remember me, oh my God, for good. And then the book ends. It's like he crams in that last prayer. But once again, we see Nehemiah praying. Nehemiah's prayer was a absolute anchor in his life. And he did, like we see here again, he prayed for good. And you'd think, what a weird ending to Nehemiah. He cleanses the priests and the Levites. He appoints the wood offering and talks about the first fruits. So he's taking care of God. And then it ends. And I think part of the reason why it ends the way it does is because the saga continues. It doesn't go away. And that's the same in our life. The saga continues. We handle this problem, this problem, this problem, this problem. Any day can bring up a new problem, and we just have to handle it. And the final end of our problems is when Jesus Christ comes back. And that's kind of the situation here. So thank you for your attention today. I really appreciate it. And next Tuesday night, we won't be in Nehemiah. we're gonna move on, but I've enjoyed doing the 3 chapters in Nehemiah and learned a bunch. So thank you so much.